ASIC. Do you have some initial comments, Caleb, on what you think of this particular case, this news article?
This is setting quite the precedent, right? We've talked about this coming for a number of years, and the government's kind of prefaced this coming through. Organizations like health professionals have a responsibility to their patients. Organizations have a responsibility to their customers to maintain the data and to keep it secure. So that's a pretty big responsibility to take. And what happens when a company gets unfortunately breached and they fall short of their responsibilities? Well, this is what's happened now. And the Australian Securities and Investments Commission is pursuing in court FIIG, and they are a financial services company. So throughout their dealings in business, they provide financial advice. And in turn of those services that they offer, they have a financial services license. As expected, they have a whole lot of data that would you expect a financial company to have, such as your driver's licenses, Medicaid cards, anything to really form that 100 points of ID. And that's to provide home loans, anything of that nature, and to provide investment advice from my understanding. They experienced a breach a couple of years ago, and
They sure did.
Their findings from the breach ultimately found out that they fell short of their obligations. So ASIC is alleging that they didn't take the adequate steps to protect themselves and their clients against a cybersecurity risk, and therefore exposed itself and themselves to further risks or beyond an unreasonable extent.
So what I find really interesting about this is the call outs from the notice of filing from ASIC, right? I think we can get some really interesting insight by looking at the concise statement that's been released and the various information around the measures that were missing and what this company, FIIG, should have done, but didn't do, right? So I found this really interesting while I was diving into it. They obviously have to prove harm as a result of the conduct, as a result of the data breach. Are there any call-outs that you have, Caleb, about what ASIC have decided to highlight here in this section?
Yeah. Well, it's quite rare that we actually see the insides of a incident response and what actually happened behind the scenes. But through a court document, we can actually see what's happened, and we get really good insights from what we can take out and implement our organizations. So there's a couple of different things in that document. The main call out is actually really the annex, and it's actually calling out all of their missing cybersecurity measures, which would have been expected. So they're calling out things like management of privileged accounts, having a cybersecurity incident response plan, vulnerability training. Yeah, all of those standard processes and, I guess, security controls. But also they've also included some insight into how the incident actually happened in point D.
Right. So what have they involved there? What have they told us about how it happened?
So how did they actually find out about this data breach happening? What we find is organizations that lack their security controls, in this case, they were notified from the ACSC, which is the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. And the Australian Cybersecurity Centre has a number of different avenues which they can identify that a company has fallen victim to an attack. When you get these notifications, it's pretty important that you take note and consider yourselves compromised and get experts in. They took a number of days, probably an unreasonable amount of time, to actually get those experts involved. And by the time that has been taken place, they actually discovered that their network had been compromised and data was exfiltrated, which is really common practice for ransomware attacks, known as double extortion, right?
I know for a lot of the attacks that we've seen, especially over the last few years, organizations have received this notification from the ACSC way down the track, right? They might have been compromised maybe months earlier, a long time ago. And I'm sure it started very simplistically in terms of these notifications where data was posted to the dark web. So the ACSC tells you that this has happened. They moved to the next stage then, when they were actively identifying indicators that were exposed to the internet that ACSC could see that indicate that a breach has occurred. Maybe that is, C2 malware is sitting there and exposed to the internet that you can see. Maybe that's a clear vulnerability, critical vulnerability on an external device, like a firewall. There are all these indicators that ACSC have available to them that tell them that a company might have been compromised. And what we see is that they're getting faster and faster at being able to identify when these things have happened. And so the notifications they give to the victims, to those that have been compromised, are becoming faster and faster as well. In this particular instance, the information available in the concise statement tells us that ACSC notified them on the 2nd of June. And the information prior to that notes that all the activity from the threat actor was happening around the 19th to the 23rd to the 30th of May, right? So this isn't a very long timeline at all, which I think is quite interesting. They've been notified pretty quickly, but nevertheless, the organization is the one being taken to court. Where we've seen a lot of organizations that have been compromised for a much longer time, but perhaps they didn't have the same regulatory requirements from a financial perspective.
Definitely. Yeah, setting the precedent again, right? Will this happen to future companies? And it really highlights the obligation that organizations should take on that data and making sure that they actually have the security controls. One of the callouts in the concise statement is actually that if they had had some, if not all of these missing controls, would they have been able to detect this? And then hopefully they might have been able to prevent the threat actor from exfiltrating some of the data or even all of the data. So if they had a SOC or some detections in place, this might have not actually got to the extent that it did. And they might have been able to safeguard those data.
Yeah, indeed. And what I find really interesting as well is they do note monitoring in these suggested controls. They say a practice of monitoring of the SIEM on a daily basis by IT personnel. That's not a high bar. On a daily basis basically just means checking it once a day. But from our perspective, we recommend you have a dedicated team monitoring a SIEM product and other security products 24/7, and that you're triaging alerts as they come in. But the bar that's been set in this precedent here is, at least check it once a day, at least. And then maybe we can look at the next things. So as we said, a lot of these controls, very simplistic, very straightforward. And as always, it's the low-hanging fruit that's being targeted by the threat actors, these attacks.
Definitely.